They didn't see it coming. Nobody in that conference room did, not my uncle's attorney, not the paralegal furiously scribbling notes in the corner, and certainly not my uncle himself, who had spent the last 3 months convinced he was about to take everything from me. What none of them knew, what nobody in that building had bothered to find out before filing a single page of paperwork, was exactly who they were dealing with. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand that morning, you have to understand the 17 years that came before it. I was 19 years old the first time I understood that love could be conditional. Not the kind of conditional love you read about in psychology textbooks, the kind with footnotes and clinical distance. I mean the kind you feel in your chest at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night when your father sets a single suitcase by the front door and tells you that you have until morning to decide between this family and that boy. The boy was Marcus. We had been together for 8 months. He was 22, worked at an auto shop 2 towns over, and had never once been anything but kind to me. He wasn't from money. His father had left when he was 11. His mother cleaned houses on the east side of Clover Falls, Tennessee, and she did it without complaint and without apology, and I loved her for it. My father called Marcus a dead end in steel-toed boots. My mother said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. I had just finished my first year at the University of Tennessee on a partial academic scholarship. I was studying pre-law. I had a 3.8 gigapascals and a professor named Dr. Aldridge who had already pulled me aside twice to tell me I had a future in this field if I was willing to work for it. I was willing. I had always been willing, but I was also 19 and stubborn, and when my father gave me that ultimatum, something inside me went very quiet and very certain all at once. I chose Marcus. I was out of the house by 7 the next morning. For the first 3 weeks, Marcus and I stayed in a 1-bedroom apartment that belonged to his cousin Raymond, who was never home and didn't seem to mind the arrangement. I slept on a pull-out couch that left a bar print across my back every morning. I ate a lot of peanut butter and a lot of rice. I applied for every waitressing job within a 12-mile radius and got hired at a diner called Patsy's on Route 9, where the coffee was always burnt and the tips were always exactly enough. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things in those early weeks. What I didn't do was call my parents. Not once. Because I knew what my mother would say, that I had made my bed, and I knew what my father would say, nothing at all, which was worse. My younger sister Becca texted me twice. Both times I wrote back. Both times she stopped replying after one exchange, and I understood that she was being watched, and I didn't push. The one person I called was my Aunt Ruth. My Aunt Ruth was my father's older sister by 9 years, which made her 56 at the time. She had never married. She had a small house on Carver Street, a garden that took up half her backyard, and an opinion about everything that she delivered with such cheerful bluntness that you almost didn't mind hearing it. She had retired early from 30 years as a registered nurse, and she spent her days now reading, gardening, and attending a Thursday night book club that she described as mostly wine with occasional literature. When I called her from the parking lot behind Patsy's Diner on a Thursday evening in October, I was not crying. I want to be clear about that. I had decided I was done crying about this. "I figured you'd call eventually," she said, before I'd even gotten 3 sentences out. "You need a place to land?" "I need to figure out how to finish school," I said. "Same thing," she said. "Come on Sunday. Bring whatever fits in that suitcase." I moved into Aunt Ruth's back bedroom on a Sunday in late October. It smelled like lavender and old wood, and there was a quilt on the bed that she had made herself, and I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time before I unpacked anything. I wasn't sad exactly. I was something more complicated than sad. I was the kind of tired that lives behind your eyes and doesn't go away with sleep. Aunt Ruth knocked on the door that first evening and handed me a cup of tea and sat in the chair by the window and looked at me with the expression she probably used to use on patients. "You're going to finish school," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm trying to figure out the money," I said. "The scholarship is still active? For now. I have to maintain my GPA, then maintain it." She took a sip of her tea. "I'll cover what the scholarship doesn't. You work your shifts at the diner, you keep your grades up, and we don't make a bigger deal out of this than it already is." I started to say something about paying her back, and she waved her hand the way she always did when a conversation was headed somewhere she found unnecessary. "You can thank me by doing something that matters," she said. "That's all I ask." I think about that sentence still. More than almost anything else she ever said to me, that one stayed. I broke up with Marcus 6 months later. It was one of the harder things I have done, and I want to say that plainly, because I don't want to make it sound like the relationship was some mistake I walked away from without grief. Marcus was a good person. He still is, as far as I know. But I was 20 years old, and I was beginning to understand what I actually wanted my life to look like. And what I wanted required a kind of focus that didn't leave room for much else. He deserved someone who was fully present. I was becoming someone who was always half somewhere else in a casebook, in a lecture, in a hypothetical argument I was constructing in my head at 2 a.m. We ended things on a Wednesday in April, in the parking lot of the same diner where I still worked 3 shifts a week. He cried a little. I held it together until I got to Aunt Ruth's kitchen, and then I didn't. She made me scrambled eggs and didn't say anything for a long time. "You're going to be okay," she finally said. "I know," I said. And I did know. That was almost the hardest part. I graduated from the University of Tennessee 3 years later with a 3.9 gigapascals and a letter of recommendation from Dr. Aldridge that she later told me was the strongest she had written in 22 years of teaching. I got into law school on my first application. Vanderbilt. Aunt Ruth drove me to Nashville herself. She helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs in August heat, and didn't complain once. When she hugged me goodbye in the parking lot, she held on for a long time. "Call me on Sundays," she said. "Every Sunday," I said. I kept that promise for 7 years. Law school was the hardest thing I had ever done. It was also the first place I had ever been where I felt completely, entirely in the right room. The work made sense to me in a way that almost nothing else had. The logic of it, the language of it, the way an argument had to be built precisely, or it collapsed. All of it felt native to something in my brain that had been waiting for the right material. I made 2 close friends. A woman named Dominique from Memphis who argued like a surgeon and laughed like someone had told her the best joke she'd ever heard, and a man named Patrick from rural Kentucky, who had grown up even poorer than I had and studied with the particular intensity of someone who knows they don't have a safety net. The 3 of us studied together most nights in the library basement, surviving on bad vending machine coffee, and a shared conviction that we were exactly where we were supposed to be. I graduated in the top 8% of my class. I took a job at a firm in Nashville, not the biggest firm, not the most prestigious, but a good firm with a reputation for serious work and attorneys who actually knew what they were doing. I worked 80-hour weeks my first 2 years, and billed more hours than anyone else at my level, and made myself indispensable in the way you can only do when you genuinely love the work. My specialty was estate law. I knew even in law school that was where I was headed. There is something about the intersection of family and money and grief and legacy that I found endlessly, sometimes painfully interesting. Estate disputes strip people down to what they actually are. You learn more about a family in an estate case than you could in 20 years of Sunday dinners. I became a partner at 31, the youngest in the firm's history. Throughout all of it, I called Aunt Ruth every Sunday without fail. I drove to Clover Falls for Thanksgiving and Christmas and her birthday in March. I brought her flowers from the Nashville farmers market when I came. I fixed the loose hinge on her back door one April weekend because she had mentioned it twice and I knew she would never actually call someone to do it. I never heard from my parents. Not when I graduated from law school. Not when I made partner. Not on my birthday. Not ever. My sister Becca had left home at 23 and moved to Atlanta, and we had slowly, carefully rebuilt something between us, not what it was before, but something honest and our own. She told me once, over the phone, that our parents asked about me sometimes. I didn't ask what they asked. I had built a life without them in it, and I had made my peace with that. It wasn't always easy, but it was mine. Aunt Ruth was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer the autumn I turned 32. She called me on a Sunday, same as always, and told me in the same tone she used to tell me about her book club and her garden. Very matter of fact. Very Ruth. "The prognosis isn't good," she said, "but I've had a good run, and I want to spend what time I have doing what I like, not sitting in a hospital." I drove to Clover Falls that same evening. I sat in her kitchen and she made tea, and we talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing, the way we always had. She was not afraid. That was the thing about Aunt Ruth. She had made her terms with life a long time ago, and she did not renegotiate under pressure. Over the next 14 months, I drove to Clover Falls every weekend. I handled her affairs quietly, carefully. the way I handled every client's affairs with precision and without drama. She had a will that she had drafted years before and wanted updated. We updated it together, she and I, sitting at her kitchen table with a pot of tea between us, and she told me exactly what she wanted and I made sure it was documented to the letter. She died on a Tuesday in January, surrounded by her garden catalogs and her books and a lavender candle burning on the nightstand, with me holding her hand and Becca on the phone from Atlanta. I did not cry at the funeral. I had already cried everything I had. What I felt, standing at her graveside in the January cold, was something I can only describe as a specific, bone-deep gratitude for the quilt on the bed, and the scrambled eggs, and the Sunday phone calls, and the 11 years of her believing in me when no one else did. 6 weeks after Aunt Ruth died, I received a phone call from a man named Gerald Hofstetter, who identified himself as an attorney representing the estate interests of my father and my Uncle Dale. I let him finish his introduction. Then I asked him to send me the paperwork. What arrived 3 days later was a formal challenge to Aunt Ruth's will. My father and his younger brother Dale were contesting the estate. Their position, as laid out across 14 pages of legal filing, was that Aunt Ruth had been unduly influenced in the drafting of her final will, specifically, by me, and that the estate should therefore be redistributed according to an earlier version of the will, in which my father and uncle were named as co-beneficiaries alongside me. The estate was valued at approximately $1.4 million. Aunt Ruth's house, her investments, a small commercial property she had purchased quietly in 2009, and 30 years of careful savings from a nursing career, and a life lived without excess. She had left it to me, all of it. I read the filing twice. I set it on my desk. I looked out the window at the Nashville skyline for a long moment. Then I called Dominique. "They're contesting the will," I said. "How solid is your documentation?" she asked. "Airtight," I said. "I drafted it myself." There was a brief pause. "Then you already know how this ends." "I know," I said. "I just wanted to hear someone else say it." What my father and uncle did not know, what Gerald Hofstetter apparently had not thought to investigate before filing, was that I was not simply the deceased's niece and primary beneficiary. I was a partner at Caldwell, Merritt and Hines, one of the most well-regarded estate law firms in Middle Tennessee. I had handled over 200 estate cases. I had been an expert witness in 3 contested will trials. I had written 2 published articles on undue influence doctrine in estate proceedings, both of which were assigned reading in at least 4 Tennessee law school courses. I also happened to have drafted and witnessed Aunt Ruth's final will myself, with 2 independent co-witnesses and a notarized capacity evaluation from her physician conducted 8 months before her death, specifically because I knew, as any estate attorney knows, that a beneficiary who is also family should be prepared for exactly this kind of challenge. Gerald Hofstetter had filed a case against one of the most qualified estate attorneys in Tennessee in her own area of expertise, on behalf of clients who had not spoken to the deceased's primary beneficiary in over 15 years, with no documentation, no medical records, and no witnesses to any alleged undue influence. I did not represent myself. That would have been inadvisable and also, frankly, too satisfying to be professional. I asked Patrick, who had built one of the sharpest litigation practices in the state, to take the case. He agreed immediately. "This will take about 40 minutes, he said. "Reviewing the filing." "Be generous," I said. "Give it an hour." The hearing was held at the Davidson County Courthouse on a Wednesday morning in April. I arrived early. I wore a navy suit that I had bought myself the month I made partner and reserved for days that required a particular kind of precision. I did not know if my father would be there. I had not seen him in 15 years. He was there. He was older, obviously heavier, with gray coming in at his temples, and something in his posture that had not been there before, a kind of forward lean that might have been aggression or might have been age. My Uncle Dale sat beside him, thick-necked and impatient-looking, already glancing at his watch at 9 in the morning. They did not see me come in. I took my seat at the respondent's table and I opened my folder, and I did not look at them again. Gerald Hofstetter came in 2 minutes later. He was a small man in a brown suit, who moved with the particular confidence of someone who had won a few cases and never adequately updated his self-assessment. He set his briefcase on the table and turned to survey the room, the way attorneys do when they're reminding themselves they belong there. His eyes found me. Stopped, moved to the nameplate in front of me, He looked at it for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a moment. Then he walked to the respondent's table, and he extended his hand, and in a voice that had lost approximately 40% of its earlier confidence, he said, "Good morning, Miss Whitfield. I wasn't aware you'd be present personally. Miss Whitfield is my associate," Patrick said pleasantly, from my right. "She's here as a fact witness regarding the will's execution. I'm Patrick Lemaire. I'll be representing the respondent." Gerald Hofstetter nodded. He went back to his table. I watched him lean down and say something quiet to my father. My father looked up then. For the first time in 15 years, his eyes found mine across a courtroom. I looked at him for exactly as long as it took me to decide I had nothing to prove, and then I looked back down at my folder. The hearing lasted 53 minutes. Patrick was, as he always was, exact and relentless, and almost disconcertingly calm. He entered the will documentation. He entered the physician's capacity evaluation. He entered the notarized witness statements. He entered both of my published articles on undue influence doctrine, and gently noted my professional credentials for the record, which included the particular detail that I had been recognized by the Tennessee Bar Association 2 years prior for excellence in estate practice. Gerald Hofstetter made his arguments. They were the arguments of a man who had not done enough research before filing. Patrick addressed each one with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics to a well-meaning adult. The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Chen, whom I had appeared before twice in professional contexts, and who gave absolutely nothing away in her expression throughout the entire proceeding, ruled from the bench. The will stood. The estate challenge was dismissed. My father and uncle were ordered to cover respondents' court costs. When the gavel came down, there was a moment of very complete silence. Then my Uncle Dale said something under his breath to my father that I did not hear, and Gerald Hofstetter began gathering his papers with the movements of a man thinking about a different career, and Patrick turned to me and said, quietly, "Told you, 53 minutes. "You were right," I said. I had not intended to speak to my father that day. I had thought about it. The way you think about something you have practiced, setting aside, you know it's there, you know where it lives. You have simply decided not to let it run the rest of your life. But as people filed out of the courtroom, my father stepped into the aisle and simply stood there, not blocking me, just standing, looking at me with an expression I did not entirely have a word for. It was not remorse exactly. It was something older and quieter than remorse. My uncle had already left. Patrick squeezed my arm briefly and gave me a look that said he'd wait outside. I stopped. My father and I stood 6 feet apart in an emptying courtroom, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. "She was proud of you," he finally said. His voice was rougher than I remembered. "Ruth. She talked about you. We saw her sometimes. Holidays. I know she didn't stop seeing you," I said. "That was her choice to make." He nodded slowly. He looked at his hands, then back at me. "I know I don't." He stopped. Started again. "What Dale wanted the lawsuit. I should have stopped it, but you didn't," I said. Not cruelly, just as a fact. He had nothing to say to that, because it was true, and he knew it. And some part of him had probably known it since the morning he set a suitcase by the front door and called it love. I picked up my bag. "I have a meeting at 1, I said. "Take care of yourself." I walked out of the courtroom and into the hallway where Patrick was waiting, leaning against the wall and looking at his phone. He straightened when he saw me and gave me a questioning look. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. And I meant it. I actually am. That evening I drove to the cemetery on the east side of Nashville, where Aunt Ruth had been buried 6 months before. I had not been back since the funeral. I brought flowers from the farmer's market, the same flowers I used to bring when I came to visit, and I set them against the stone, and I sat in the grass for a while. The thing about grief, I have come to believe, is that it doesn't ask for a particular occasion. It arrives when it arrives. Sitting there in the late afternoon light with the city quiet around me, I felt the full weight of everything at once, not heavily, not unbearably, but completely. The suitcase by the door, the pull-out couch, the tea in the kitchen, the Sunday calls, the 14 months of weekends at her bedside, the quilt she had made by hand that was now folded on the chair in my bedroom in Nashville. "Thank you," I said, out loud, to no one and everyone, and to her specifically. The wind moved through the grass. I drove home with the windows down. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt exactly like what it was mine, fully mine, built from scratch and held together by my own hands, and the love of one woman who had asked nothing from me except that I do something that mattered. I was 32 years old, I had a career I had earned, and a life I had chosen, and a name that stood for something in the state of Tennessee. And somewhere across the city, in a courtroom that had already moved on to the next case, there was a filing that would now be closed forever. A last attempt to take something from me by people who had never understood that the most important things I carried, no one could ever touch.